All right, good evening. We're so glad that you're here. Welcome to the OceanSide Church of Christ. We are already in class 4 of our series. It's really going by quickly. My wife and I were discussing earlier today that it's surprising that next week we'll be halfway through the series, but we have had a great group that has been here every week, and I'm so encouraged by that. I appreciate your attendance again tonight. Tonight we switched gears a bit. As the previous 3 weeks, we were basically proving in 3 different ways and perspectives the existence of God. But now we're going to prove that the Bible is His Word, and that this God we're discussing is the God of this book, the Bible. And so in doing so, in a 2-parter, this week, tonight, we want to discuss the inspiration of the Bible. And next week, we want to discuss the alleged contradictions of the Bible. Those that say there are discrepancies. We have a lot of folks that are leaving the brotherhood, leaving Christianity altogether because they believe that there are factual discrepancies, factual contradictions in the Bible. And it's true that if there are contradictions, then it is not the inspired Word of God. And so we want to address that next week. But let's talk tonight about some evidences that would show us or suggest to us that this book really is inspired. We know that this book claims inspiration. Can somebody tell us a passage where the Bible, within its passages, would say such? That's right, 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17. Possibly the most familiar one. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, complete, thoroughly furnished unto all or every good work. So the Bible claims to be inspired. 2 Peter 1:3, it has everything, all things that pertain to life and godliness. It claims to be from God. It claims to be complete. But how can we be sure? Just because this book says it's inspired doesn't mean necessarily that it is. That alone isn't enough evidence. Right? You can go into the courtroom and declare your stance all day, but if you don't have evidence, what's that judge going to say? Sorry, adios, I'm not having it, right? You've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we want to tonight prove the Bible's inspiration. Where would we begin? What are some ways, and by the way, for those of you who have been a member at OceanSide for a while, many of you have, we talked about this somewhat before. We did a class on it. And so some of this will be familiar to you. Some of this is going to be slightly new material. Of course, those that will be hearing this on audio, it will be new material, as well as those who were not here during that class. But that aside, some of you ought to have a bit of an advantage in answering some of these questions. And remember, what are some of the ways in which we can prove the Bible's inspiration? How do you use this book and in using it prove that there is information in here that only God could give, especially in the time in which it was written? Yes, sir. Science. Good. The scientific accuracy of the Bible, right? If it's true that there are things in this book that were scientifically true before we discovered them, right? Years and centuries and centuries before we discovered them, right? That would certainly give some evidence to the fact that a creator or a God must have been involved in allowing those men and teaching those men these things before we even discovered them. That certainly would give evidence. Excellent. Any other ones you might could think of? We'll talk about those. Prophecies. Excellent. That's right. Prophecies and the fulfillments thereof. Absolutely. If this book talks about things accurately and detailed before they happen, and then they happen exactly the way it said that they would, that's certainly miraculous. That would mean someone is omniscient, someone is all-knowing and knows the future. And that certainly would give evidence for God. Any others that you might could think of?
Chronology.
Okay, the chronology, good. The history, the chronology of the events that take place, absolutely give evidence as well.
Archaeology.
Excellent. That's right. Standing the test of time. That's exactly right. Archaeology is another great one. There are so many. Yes, sir. Yes, our calendar of the year. That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. There are, and maybe many others we could mention. Let's take a few of those that were just mentioned and go into greater detail about them, starting with the most maybe simplistic to discuss, and that is kind of talking about the test of time, as David back there mentioned. Let's talk about for a moment the unity of the Bible. A very short and simple but profound evidence for biblical inspiration. What do we mean when we say the unity of the Bible can show us that there is a God? What's so significant about the Bible's unity? What are we talking about when we say the Bible is full of unity amongst its books?
It's written by 40 different men over
That's it.
1,500 years.
Exactly. You're talking about 40 different authors that wrote this book. And as he just mentioned, over a period of some 1,600 years that this was written. The first book, some would argue that's Job, some Genesis, but approximately when was the first book written, if you were to round it to the nearest 100th? About what year was the first book written? BC, of course. Around 1500, they believe, BC. Somewhere between 14 and 1500 BC, they round it. Approximately 1500 BC would have been the first book of the Bible written. Many scholars would argue that that was Job. And if you go to the New Testament, to the very last book, which was what? What's the most recent written book in the Bible? Revelation. That's right, Revelation. And if you were to round that to the nearest 100th, it would be in what year? 100 AD. And so you've got a period of about 1,600 years from 1500 BC to 100 AD. And those 40 different authors wrote from different continents, right? Were they all in America? Did any of them write in America? No, of course not. Where were the authors located? The majority of them were in what two continents when they were writing? Asia and Europe. Asia and Europe. Arguably, it could be, based upon Moses' location, a third in that of Northeast Africa, but at least two continents. All right, 40 different authors over 1,600 years, two different continents. It's not like they're even in the same room trying to write these things. And then, of course, it was written in three different languages. What were those three languages? Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. Very good. Aramaic. Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. So you've got all of these details going into this. And if we can prove, and we're going to take time to do that next week, we'll postpone that. But for now, if we can prove, and I believe that we will, that all of the words in this book, none of them contradict each other. They're in complete unity in all the stories and all the years and writings, then that is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, think about that. Over a period of 1,600 years, different continents, 40 different guys. And by the way, were those 40 different authors, did they all have the same trade, the same background, the same upbringing? No, we could talk about the one was a tax collector, you've got kings, you've got fishermen, you've got tent makers. We can go through the list of all the different scenarios. What are the chances if we just took this room and talked about an event in history that maybe all of you could have witnessed? Let's say that you all witnessed a ball game or a battle between people, or World War II, or whatever you want to talk about, and we all sat down in the same room and at the same time wrote all the details we could have noticed and remembered about that event. Do you think there would be zero discrepancies in our writings? Even that alone there would be problems with. But you take these extremes and there not be any discrepancies, that is miraculous. And there are zero factual discrepancies. Now here comes a question that you sometimes get. Is it not possible that through the generations, I mean, this was written, so we're in the 21st century, and we're talking about 100 AD at the absolute latest that this book was finished, that the last book was written. You've got a huge span of time there. Is it not possible that through the generations and the translations and the transmissions that men would have messed up and gotten off course with this book? How do we know that what we're reading right now is really what was written during that time? How do you answer that question when someone asks it? And I've gotten it several times. You probably have too. Is it? Are we sure that this is that original writing? Can we be positive? And if so, how?
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, good. Manuscripts, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Somebody tell us, speaking of those, somebody tell us about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why would that give us evidence that this book today is accurate? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
They're found in a cave by a shepherd in a jar.
That's it. A shepherd. You remember he was throwing rocks into a cave, and if I remember the story correctly, he heard a crack, and he went in, and there was jars, lots of clay or jars, I imagine, and he found in those jars what? These scrolls, these Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they are, today, as I'm aware, that they are the second oldest Hebrew manuscripts that we have. And there was over 800, I believe, or so of those just in that cave alone. And they take those manuscripts, and they had a full, complete set of Isaiah and another that was about 75% complete, just of that one book. But they take all of those manuscripts, and then they compare it with the Old Testament we have written right here. And what did they find? It was incredible how accurate what we had today was compared to those Dead Sea Scrolls, which they dated, I don't remember the exact date, but probably 2nd or 3rd century AD that those scrolls were written in. And we find them so recently, and yet we're so accurate. But that's the idea. These manuscripts that we have, we can look at, and we have, for the New Testament, we have over 5,400 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament alone, the law that we're under. And some of those date all the way back to the 2nd century AD. When was the book of Revelation finalized? At the end of what century? At the end of the 1st century, right? We're talking about just 100 years later, and we have manuscripts that date that far back. And today, they coincide. They are very close to accurate with this. In fact, I should say, I read that one scholar noted that the accuracy of the Bible with those old manuscripts is only one thousandth off, is how he put it. Now, I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but it was very, very, very accurate. There's no, salvation or soul binding problems or discrepancies between those manuscripts and the book we have today. And so all those things put together, we're using what they wrote almost verbatim in the 1st century and prior to it, many years prior to it. Very, very interesting. But let's go a little deeper now. Let's talk about the prophecies. We're going to talk more about the discrepancies next week. So let's jump into the prophecies a bit. Now, I looked and was looking through the prophecies, trying to pick the best one, and I wanted to do something different because some of you are going to remember this, but I'm telling you what, I don't know a stronger prophecy than the one found in Ezekiel 26. Let's go to Ezekiel 26 together. There are lots of prophecies. There are over 300 messianic prophecies, that is, prophecies of Christ alone, and lots of details. But I love this particular one because of the historical accuracy that we can look at. We don't have to just listen to the Bible. In other words, a lot of the Messianic prophecies, you see it in the Old and then they write about it in the New. And somebody could say, well, that's simple. They just said it came true in the New Testament. That doesn't prove anything. But with this prophecy, you can't debate that because historically, we know this to be completely accurate. Ezekiel 26, beginning in verse 2. All right, around 586 BC, all right, we know historically that King Nebuchadnezzar attacked and tried to besiege the city of Tyre, Tyre. And when he did so, as you recall, they were able to flee. There was an inland, an island that they had just into the water. This was a port city. And they were able to escape out to that island, many of them, and they survived. And the city was not besieged. Well, about 250 years later, during the time of the Greeks, someone ended up finally conquering Tyre. Who was that great leader of the Greek armies? Alexander the Great. And you recall that he was going to that, he wanted to go to that island, in fact, because he wanted to sacrifice at the temple of Heracles. But they would not allow him. They were so arrogant that they turned down this man who's conquering anywhere he goes. They tell him, absolutely not. We're not going to let you sacrifice here. And so what did Alexander do? He immediately started plotting the destruction of this town. Now they all went out to this island as he comes to attack, and Alexander did something that Nebuchadnezzar didn't. He didn't give up. He had those men work for hours. Some 10,000 men were pushing, you remember that city, the rubble, into the water. And eventually, it stacked up so much that they were able to create a causeway, a bridge, if you will, out to that island. and destroy those people. And historically, that's what we know about what happened to the city of Tyre, and Alexander finished it off. Interestingly, to this day, you can go and visit this area. The city was never rebuilt. It still wasn't today. And do you remember what they do for sport there? What's very popular? Fishing. Fishing is very popular in this area. Now, historically, all those things we know to be true. In 586 BC, a few months before Nebuchadnezzar attacked, Ezekiel wrote the words that we're about to read. Look at verse number 2. And by the way, we know it's 586 because he tells us it's the 11th year of Jehoiakim, and you can go back and date the Babylonian captivity. And so 11 years after 597 puts us at 586, about the time this was written, because he records, verse 1 there, the 11th year of that reign. And so look at verse 2. Son of man, because that Tyrus, that is Tyre, has said against Jerusalem, Aha, she is broken, that was the gates of the people. She's turned unto me, I shall be replenished. Now she is laid waste. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Tyre, and will cause many nations to come up against thee, as the sea causeth his waves to come up. They'll destroy the walls of Tyre, break down her towers. I will scrape her dust from her, and make her like the top of a rock. Notice, it shall be a place for spreading nets in the midst of the sea, for I've spoken it, saith the Lord God, and it shall become a spoil to the nations. And her daughters which are in the field shall be slain by the sword, and they shall know that I am the Lord. For thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will bring upon Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, that is, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, a king of kings from the north, with horses, chariots, horsemen. You can continue reading all the way through verse 14, all the detail that went in to this besieging, to this destruction. My page turned on me, threw me off there. Verse number 14, that's right. And he says, I'll make thee like the top of a rock, verse 14. Thou shalt be a place to spread nets upon, and thou shalt build it no more. For I, the Lord, have spoken it, saith the Lord God. Now, based on the history that I just gave you, and I want you to go and, of course, look that up for yourself. Don't take my word for it by any means. But what did you notice in some of the details that we just read that would compare to historically what happened?
Spreading their nets.
Yeah, spreading the nets. That's pretty detailed, isn't it? It's going to be a place where people will fish. It's never going to be rebuilt. It will be a fisherman's area. And that's exactly what it is, even still today. That is absolutely fascinating to me. Did you notice any names? Did he specifically name anyone that would attack Tyre? Nebuchadnezzar, that's right. It named Nebuchadnezzar, didn't it? But see, there's a discrepancy, some would say. You see, who isn't named here? Alexander the Great, right? Historically, that's what happened. But Ezekiel doesn't mention Alexander. It says Nebuchadnezzar. And so many would say, allegedly, this is not accurate because Nebuchadnezzar did not fully conquer Tyre, which is true, historically speaking. But what did you notice, or did you notice anything in particular? Okay, they mentioned the scraping off, didn't they? There in verse 4, which is not in connection to Nebuchadnezzar, by the way. That comes later. He mentions that will happen, but we know Alexander did that. But what in this text jumps out at you that shows that he was not inaccurate, that he did in fact show that there would be another individual or nation that would come? Look at verse 3. What does he say he's going to cause to happen? Many nations, plural. Nebuchadnezzar did come and he's named, but Ezekiel, true or false, said there would be more than one nation. Absolutely. Many nations, in fact, more than one, at least two, are going to come. And we know that certainly the Greeks were involved. By the way, what nations were there in between the Babylonians and the Greeks? What two kind of coupled together there? What kingdom or empire reigned in between the two in the chronologically speaking, historically? Well, that was after the Greeks were the Romans. Before the Greeks, but after the Babylonians. King Darius, ring a bell? Persians, yeah, the Medes and Persians, right? The Medo-Persian kingdom, we call it. And so you've got several nations that were in power during this time. At least four, I guess you could technically name. But we know at least two did, in fact, attack. So let me put some of these details up here. Nebuchadnezzar sieges and plunders Tyre, and he certainly did outside of that inland city, the island there. You notice that many nations are going to attack. Tyre will be flattened like a rock, as Jay mentioned. That's very significant. That's who could have said, who would have known, or could have just guessed by chance that this city's not only going to get destroyed, he's going to name who did it and how they did it, but also they're going to be it's going to be flattened like a rock, like the surface of a rock. That is very detailed. There's no way 250 years prior to that occasion that Ezekiel could have just guessed that that was going to happen. We know that he wrote this around 586 BC, and we know Alexander came and did what he did, finished the job around 332 BC. In fact, historians say Alexander knew about the prophecy. He knew about it and then ended up being the one to fulfill it. The stones would be pushed into the sea. Again, these are just details. We mentioned most of these. Tyre will never be rebuilt. Very interesting. We could talk about lots of prophecies, but this alone is one that I've certainly used and many of you may have as well, and there are others that we could talk about. But how in the world, just this one prophecy alone, how in the world could he have gotten that detail? What are the chances you think that he could have just guessed? Is there even a possibility that he could have guessed all those details? There's no way. Absolutely no way. He had miraculous knowledge. Certainly seems probable that he got that from God Almighty. All right, let's go into something else, a little different here. Any thoughts about prophecies or unity or anything we've talked about up to this point? Yes, sir.
Another thing on unity is that historians outside of the Bible that really were not inspired, but they back up what the Bible
Yes,
says.
Excellent point. Lots of historians. Name maybe one of the most popular? Josephus, absolutely. Lots of his writings. Even those in the atheistic community would accept the fact that he was a historical writer, and he coincides well. Most of his writings go very well with what happened biblically speaking, and he attests to witnessing those things and those around him that had seen those things and through the generations there. Anything else? Any other thoughts? He's not the only one. There are lots of others. I couldn't name all the historians for you, but he's certainly one of the main ones. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about some medical foreknowledge. We'll get to the science too, but I don't think we spent a lot of time talked about this one much in the past. One of these we did, the first one. What is one of the most commonly... lost my mic there. What is one of the most maybe commonly used or remembered biblical medical things that the Bible discusses that we knew nothing about for so many years? Back in Genesis, do you remember? Circumcision, absolutely. I want to remind you of this, and some of you may not be aware of this. You remember in Genesis 17 and verse 12, when was it, on what day was Abraham to circumcise these babies that were born into Israel? Day 8. Day 8. Why would God choose day 8? Did you just pull that number out of the hat? Right? Why? How could Moses, in writing this, let me back up. Why would Moses, in writing this, say day 8? Why would he mention day 8? What do we now know that we just discovered in 1935, by the way? What do we know about day 8?
Say that the coagulation process is most effective. It just has a very short window based on that day.
Absolutely. The coagulation process, the clotting of the blood, is most effective naturally on day 8. And we know that, and this is a chart I found. I hope you can see that fairly well. It's showing up pretty good. But after the baby's born, there's a process, and over the first few days, his prothrombin level, vitamin K, produces prothrombin, and as the days progress, that level goes up, and that vitamin K, of course, and prothrombin are involved with coagulation, with the clotting of the blood. And so as that baby grows to day 8, that is the highest point, over 100% extra prothrombin is produced in that baby's life on day 8. In a natural, normal birth, which is most all cases, that's always going to be the rule. There's very few exceptions to that. Unless there's some kind of defect, and that sometimes happens, unfortunately. But outside of that, this is the way it's going to be. Every one of you in this room, and myself included, probably had this process. On day 8, that was the best day if you were going to perform some kind of surgery or do something that would cause that baby to bleed, day 8's the best day. Right? You adults know what circumcision is. And so why would God say on day 8 is the day you need to circumcise that child? Well, because that child's the blood is going to not be as outgoing. I'm trying to gross you out. You know what I mean by that. It's going to clot better. They didn't have the medicines that, they can do it, day 1 or day 2, I guess, however they do that now, I don't even know, but they can, they have medicines and can do that, but they couldn't then. So how's that baby not going to just bleed out? Well, it's going to be because they do that on day 8. How in the world could Moses have known that without biblical inspiration, without God telling him? Well, let's look at something else. Numbers chapter 19. Numbers chapter 19. In 1847, in Vienna, Austria, there was a hospital ward. And you can go on and research what I'm about to tell you. Very interesting. But there was a hospital ward in which many, many mothers gave birth. And after a while, after there was a death in this of a particular mother that gave birth, the deaths became more and more prominent, more and more common. In fact, at the worst point, 18%, 1 in every 6 women that gave birth in that facility did not make it out alive. And so as they were doing the autopsies, the gentleman, and I forget his name, but one of the directors of the hospital there, he began to watch everything that was going on to try to figure out why in the world these women were not coming out of this hospital. And upon doing some research, he discovered what was happening. They would take these dead bodies during the autopsy, touch them with their hands, and then when they were done, they would take those hands and they would wash them in a bowl of water. All right? And then they would take just water. They would wash their hands in that water, and then they would take it and wash on their hands, dry them off on a cloth. They'd pass that cloth around and all use it. And they wouldn't change clothes, and then they would go perform whoever, this next woman that was in labor, they would birth the child. Now, what do we obviously know today that they did not know in 1847? They thought these women were dying of labor fever, they called it. Right? But what was happening? Yes, absolutely. And it was interesting because all of the autopsies were very, very similar with some of the, you can look up the details. It's very gross to even think about it or picture it. But what was going on? Well, they realized that there was some germs going on, just to put it simple, bacteria that's being spread. And so he decided to put a chlorine solution mixture into the water, and they began to use that and begin to change clothes and use different towels. And that number went from 18% to 1%. 1%, 1 out of 100 women ended up losing their life in that facility. They didn't, at that point in time, they didn't know about bacteria and dead bodies and the spread of those germs and sanitation, all of those things. You know where we're going with this. Somebody read for us out loud Numbers 19, verses 11 and 12, written approximately 1400 BC. What does he say? Numbers 19, 11 and 12, someone that's willing.
He that toucheth the dead body of any man shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with it on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day he shall be clean. But if he purify not himself the 3rd day, then the 7th day he shall not be clean. Excellent.
What did Moses write about in 1400 BC with regards to a dead body? If you touch that dead body, what's the statement? You are unclean. For how long? A couple of minutes? A couple hours? 7 days. In fact, if you don't purify yourself, which we're going to talk about that in a moment, if you don't go through the purification process, then in 7 days are you clean? You're still not clean. Right? How could he have known that? We didn't even know that until what? Or at least some of us didn't anyways in 1847 even. Right? That's incredible information. And by the way, on a side note, Leviticus 13:46 is a passage about quarantining. That is, keeping someone outside of the camp. Right? Moses knew by inspiration. He knew you don't be around. When you've got a disease, you've got something that's contagious, you need to get away from other people. Right? When this Ebola I get E. coli and Ebola, it's Ebola, that was going around rampantly. What were they doing when there were cases in the United States? They'd quarantine them. They'd put them in a room and by themselves, they'd quarantine them, and they were very careful with that process. We didn't learn about that. We didn't know that was necessary for many, many years, but Moses knew about it. How did he know that? Right? Did they just have the technology and all that and know all that stuff back then, and then somewhere down the line it all exploded and we reset? No. They didn't have that material, that information, not amongst themselves anyways. God gave it to them. Speaking of that purification process, go down to verse 17. Numbers 19, 17. Someone read 17 and 18, and let's see if God just said to use water when you purify yourself. Numbers 19, 17, and 18. After all, God uses water, spiritually speaking, right, as purification. Someone read that for us.
And for an unclean person, they shall take some of the ashes of their heifer, burnt for purification from sin, and running water shall be put on them in a vessel.
Excellent. Verse 18 as well.
A clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, sprinkle it on the tent, on all the vessels, on the persons who were there, or on the one who touched a bone, the slain, the dead, or a grave.
Outstanding. Thank you. Excellent. So, purification process is to take this red heifer and do what? This dead red heifer. And somebody said it. Yes, create ashes. You're going to burn it. Create ashes. And then what's going to be put through the ashes? Hyssop. And even before that, you're going to dip the hyssop in the product. But what else gets mixed in with those? Water. So you've got, hyssop's absolutely true. So you've got the ashes, you've got, and specifically, what's the adjective before the word water? Running water. Very significant. Running water into those ashes and dip the hyssop. Now, the early pioneers of this country, obviously, they couldn't go to the supermarket and just buy purification, just buy soap like we can, or antibacterial, that stuff we have on the table. We've used it all up. We're unsanitary. We need to get some more, don't we? But they couldn't do that. So what did they do in order to be purified? We've talked a little about this before. Those of you who remembers at OceanSide, you remember, hopefully, this product called lye soap, L-Y-E. Does that ring a bell? How did the pioneers of this country, how did they create lye soap? What's the recipe for lye? Ash. It is, absolutely. You take ash and you put what in it or through it? Running water. Water goes through it. It's running water. Very significant that he mentions that specifically. You put water through it, and the water is mixed with what comes from that, the ashes. It took me a second. Well, as you run that water through the ashes, it's mixed with I forget the name of it, thymol, something like that. Anyways, whatever it is, there's a particular product that comes into that water that makes it be just like lye soap, which is something, by the way, that's used if you ever buy some of those things to drain under your clogs, Drano and stuff like that you get. Some of those have lye in them. That's what they're using because it's such a strong and concentrated. It destroys that stuff. We'll just call it that stuff, that gross stuff. And on top of that, what do you know about hyssop? The plant hyssop that was dipped in there. What is hyssop in today that you might use on a daily basis? I'll give you a hint. That's as good as I could do with that. I didn't think that through before I tried. Mouthwash. Yes, that was gargling, by the way. It was a horrible impression, but mouthwash. Right? You have Listerine or something like that. You're probably going to see hyssop on there. Some of the products certainly do have that. But that is an antibacterial. And so plant. And so you dip that in there. So basically you've got soap and antibacterial going on at the same time. And it's certainly involved in that purification process. Again, do you think Moses just guessed and just got all that right? It just happened to be a great solution for soap and antibacterial products? No way, Jose. He was inspired. All of that information would point to that. Leviticus 17. You ever heard of bloodletting? One more example on the medical side of this, but what is bloodletting?
Let the evil spirits out.
That's it. Letting the evil spirits out. What would they do in order to get the evil spirits out of the body many, many eons ago?
Lead people.
That's it. They'd bleed them. They'd bleed them out. They'd get that blood. I was reading where a lot of times they would do it from the elbow, apparently, and they'd let the blood come out because they believed that was how you got rid. In fact, do you remember a president that underwent that process? George Washington. George Washington, they believe. And of course, they found that did not produce the results they were expecting. You've heard of maybe leeches. They would put leeches on people and have those leeches pull out they thought they were pulling out the infection in the blood or whatever. But Leviticus 17:11, the Bible already made it clear that what is in the blood? Life. Life is in the blood. Again, just another medical accuracy of the Bible that we just didn't know because we didn't use this for so many years. Or the doctors weren't using this, I should say. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
And they put the leeches all over her.
Is that right?
All over her body.
To pull out that infection.
Threw it all out and they healed her.
That doesn't surprise me. So some still even do it today. Very interesting. It healed her, yeah. Yeah, and I imagine, when leeches do that, I imagine they're pulling stuff out. They're getting some blood out, but is that's not what God's remedy was to solve the problem. And certainly, some of the things they're trying to remedy for many years, and in George Washington's case, did not cut it. Let's talk a little about our time is running quickly. Let's go to Leviticus 11 for a moment. Leviticus 11. Nobody would, not that there's not some guys who had this memorized, but I know I certainly don't, and many of us, probably most if not all of us, don't have it memorized, all the details as to what foods that they were not to eat under the old law, what animals, rather, they were not to eat. There's a lot of details in there, and animals that are specifically named, but in around, and the date just left me, I want to say it was the early 1900s, I can't think of the exact date, but there was a gentleman who did a study, a research study in which he took the animals listed in Deuteronomy 14 and Leviticus 11, and he tested their toxicity levels, how toxic they were. And it was very interesting, the results that came out of this, because he very quickly realized why these animals were chosen, because they were, of course, very toxic for us to eat without proper treatment, of course, which they did not have at the time. For example, somebody read Leviticus 11 and verse 12. Just a couple of examples that we'll look at.
Whosoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you.
Excellent. If it doesn't have fins, and if it doesn't have scales, or either the way it's worded here, either one of those is true. It has fin and not scales, or scales and not fins. If it doesn't have both scales and fins, then you cannot what? Don't eat it. Don't eat it. Right? Now we know, and based on this particular gentleman's study, David Mott was his name, by the way, it just came to me. When he did this study, he tested an example of that which had fins and did not have scales, and he used the blowfish. And the blowfish, if you were to eat a blowfish raw, it has, in fact, from what I was reading, it has the poison, the toxin in that, is 1,200 times stronger than cyanide. You're familiar with that. It is 160,000 times more potent than cocaine, the toxin in it. And it's called troxadomine or something to that effect. It's got a nice scientific word, medical term, but it is not good. It is very bad for you. And again, Moses, did he just happen to know this? Right? Why would he mention that which does not have scales or does not have fins and needs to not be eaten? What about shellfish? We have many probably who are allergic to shellfish. I know a couple, or at least one of you is, because we talked about it recently. But even things like oysters, if they're not treated properly, oysters carry, and there's a bacteria, it's got a nice Latin term, I'll let you look it up and try to pronounce it yourself. But 50% of the people, studies have shown that inhale or eat in that bacteria lose their life. In 2004, I believe, was the last study that was done, and 50% of everyone that ate raw oysters and got that bacteria within their bodies lost their lives. Even shellfish. The Bible is full of these medical inspired ideas. Leviticus 11, again, when you look at verse 3, I'll tell you what, go to verse 29. Very quickly, verse 29. At the end of verse 29, I want you to notice he mentions the tortoise. Verse 30, he mentions the chameleon. He mentions the lizard. What category of animals are those three? Reptiles. Reptiles. And you go back to verse 3, and most reptiles are included anyways because of the description there. But what do we know about reptiles? 90% of all reptiles carry, they say, what? You can get it from raw chicken too. Salmonella. Salmonella. Right? If you were to eat reptiles and amphibians, same would be true for amphibians. They are, 90% of them, I believe, is the last number I read, most recent number, they say are natural carriers of salmonella. And he mentions here, don't eat these reptiles, just don't do it. And interestingly, we now know that salmonella is one of those things that you can also get from touch, right? And we know that. You deal with raw chicken, you can get it on your hands. But again, they already knew that. Moses already knew that somehow. Look at verse 32. Upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, doth fall and be unclean, whether it be any vessel of wood or raiment or sack, whatever that thing touches, in other words, it must be put under water, and it shall be unclean until the even, so it shall be cleansed. Every earthen vessel, whether in any of them falleth, whatsoever in it shall be unclean, shall break it. All meat which may be eaten, that on which such water cometh, shall be unclean, and all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean. If any of this stuff touches any of these vessels that you're drinking out of, that vessel's unclean, right? You put raw chicken in a cup, you want to drink any water out of that cup? You're not drinking the raw chicken, right? You're not eating the raw chicken, but it's infected the cup, right? Moses, in essence, knew that right here, right? These reptiles, these other animals. We could talk about bats. What do bats carry? Leviticus 11:19. Don't eat a bat. Why not? Rabies. Rabies. Just a decade ago, a study was done. 26 cases of rabies, people dying from rabies, and 24 of them came from bats. Right? That's very significant. How did Moses know all these details? Right? He must have been inspired. I think you're getting the idea. Let me throw a couple more out here. For time's sake, I'll just mention them. Isaiah 40 and verse 22 says that the earth is round. When did we discover that? We sing the little, or say the little phrase about who sailed the ocean blue? Who was it? Columbus. And they argue that it was discovered a little before then, but we could debate that. But what was the date? 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Right? Earth is round. Isaiah knew that in what? 7th century BC? When he wrote that down, Isaiah 40 and verse 22. How did he know the earth wasn't flat and we wouldn't just fall off the edge? Right? He must have been inspired. Job 25:28. Air has what? Weight, right? We talk about airplanes and them talking about the mass of the air. Very interesting. We didn't know that until just over a century ago. Not even a century ago, I should say. Job 26 and verse 7. The earth, who's holding up the earth? It hangeth on nothing. That's a trick question, but you got it. It hangeth on nothing, right? Is it sitting on the back of a turtle, as some believed? Is it sitting on the back of the Greek god Atlas? That's a cool, I mean, it's neat to think about, right? I mean, that's how and that's very interesting, but it hangs on what? Nothing. Nothing. Job 26:7. Amos 9 and verse 6. I've told you before, I've always been very interested in meteorology. Amos 9:6 mentions the water cycle in so many words. The water cycle. In fact, if you're taking notes, is anybody jotting these down? Am I going too quick? I know I'm kind of flying here, and this will be online too, but let me just throw these three up here in case you want to write them down. Ecclesiastes 1:7, Job 26:8, and Ecclesiastes 11:3. Those three verses together discuss the entire water cycle. Talks about Ecclesiastes 1:7 is how the water goes down from the mountains, from the higher terrain, and where does it end up? The ocean. It leads all to the rivers, and the rivers to the ocean. Ecclesiastes 1:7. Then what happens to the water in the ocean? It evaporates, goes up to the clouds, Job 26 and verse 8. And then once it gets up in the clouds, and what happens next? It rains and comes back down to earth, Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 3. How did Solomon and Job, how did they know about this water cycle? How did they put that together? Obviously, they were inspired. Have we made this clear just yet? How do you get around all of this in combination together? Yes, sir.
Another one that's always appealed to me is, I believe it was Paul who said that the things that are seen are made of things unseen.
Yes.
That almost sounds like atoms.
Huh, interesting. Things that are...
You can't see it now, but everything's made up of atoms.
That's right. You can't see an atom, but it's made up of it. The things that are made... is that Romans 1:20? We need to... I want to remember that, because that's an excellent point, excellent passage. I never thought about that being atoms. The invisible things of Him... Nope, that's not the one. It's probably the one in Hebrews then. But nonetheless, I'll look that up and get that to you next week. But that is an excellent passage, absolutely. Let's jump to our discussion, a few discussion thoughts, and then we'll leave. I'll skip a point. I don't usually do that, you know me, but I'm going to skip a whole point and go to the end and not to try to shove that down, as it were. How about this? How can we know that the Bible is still accurate, being written nearly 2,000 years ago? By way of review and by way of repetition, so that we can retain this information, because there was a lot of it. What do we know? How do we know that this information is true even today, even though it was written 2,000 years ago?
Because prophecies and come fulfilled.
Scientific proof, historical proof.
Okay, good. All the things we talked about, scientific proof, historical proof. And by the way, again, in reference to the way it was transmitted, why do we know that man hasn't messed it up over the 2,000 years? Sorry? Yeah, because of the scrolls and all these manuscripts that we have, right? To prove that. Excellent.
And the scientific facts are still valid.
And the scientific facts are still valid. Absolutely. That's a great point. The laws of science, they're called laws for a reason, because they never what? They never change. What about this one? If the four Gospels are all inspired, why can they contain different information? I didn't really talk about this one. Okay, good. Different points of view? Absolutely. Are they still in unity together? How's that possible if they have different info? Okay, yeah. Four different individuals wrote it, different perspectives. And as long as they don't what? Contradict, they can have different info. The reason I put this question in here is some people argue, well, you've got four inspired writers. Why would they write four different things? Well, as we just mentioned, for one, they are four different people, four different perspectives. Did God force them to write without using their minds at all? How do we know that? How do we know that they were able to use their own talents and perspectives a bit and were more led than forced? Okay, good, yeah. Absolutely.
That was his background. So he's going to write things that would be interesting to him based on his knowledge as a medical person.
Absolutely. So she mentioned Luke as a physician. As he's writing, he's looking at it from the perspective of a doctor, and you can see that in his writing in each different perspective. Did you have a thought, Miss Renee?
One in particular.
Yes.
If we read the Bible, it builds our belief, our faith, and makes everything come to if we study the Word of God.
That's right. Absolutely. That's right. Reading and studying it builds our faith. And especially from the perspective of this lesson, when you're reading it and seeing all of this information that's so factual and not incorrect. Bill?
I think I heard Brother Baxter say one time that the reason you know it's not written by uninspired men is if an uninspired man sat there and write, he would go on and on and on and on, and you know, and inspired men reveal only what God wanted his people to know at that time.
That's an excellent point. The inspired men, they wrote down what was necessary and no more. But if they were uninspired, he mentioned that they would have went on and on and on and on, trying to get all this information in and answer all the questions. And there's a lot of things we don't have revealed, but we know that the secret things belong to God. That's an excellent point. Larry? Yes, sir?
They were also written to different populations,
Yes.
different persons.
Very, very true. Even the four Gospels, and that's probably what you're talking about, right? The Gospels. Who did Matthew write to primarily? The Jews. The Jews. And you see references when he talks about, for example, he mentions kingdom of heaven a lot, kingdom of God, right? Talking to the Jews, and they understood that to reference what? What's he talking about? When Jesus says, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. What is the kingdom? From Matthew, he's talking about the church. Whereas other writers sometimes would reference the kingdom, and they might be talking about heaven. There's some. So, anyways, we could get more into that. But each of them, in fact, the four gospel writers, if we really wanted to get into it, each of them kind of had a unique group that they were speaking to, that they focused upon. But we are 5 minutes out, and I don't want to keep you all the way till 8 o'clock every week. I just don't want to do that to you. So let's conclude. Unless there's something else very important that really needs to be said. I appreciate you so much being here and your time and your attention. And I hope you'll be here next week as we study something a bit unique and talking about the alleged contradictions. We're going to look at some passages, some things that seem on the surface to contradict. We're going to talk about some of the rules, what is and what isn't contradiction, and discuss some of those verses. In fact, you may have some verses that you have some questions about. Bring those with you and let's discuss them. And we'll apply the rules to that, and I believe we'll be able to see that they do not, in fact, contradict. But if they do, then we have a major problem. And so we need to tackle that together. God bless each of you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Hopefully we'll see all of you. Well, tonight everybody here is going to be here tomorrow night, I know. So we'll see you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. But hopefully maybe we'll have some visitors then too. But and hopefully, still, I hope you have a good weekend. It's just not here just yet. But y'all have a safe night and take care.